The Vorath Collective had been mapping the galaxy for 6,000 years. Not exploring, mapping. There is a difference. Exploration implies wonder. The Vorath had processed wonder out of their cultural vocabulary approximately 3,000 years ago, replacing it with a more efficient concept they called thuruk, the satisfaction of completing a data set. Senior cartographer HFY stood inside the measurement chamber aboard the survey vessel Patient Accumulation and stared at the anomaly on her resonance board. She had 4 eyes, 2 for close detail, 2 for peripheral pattern recognition, and all 4 were currently doing something they rarely did together. They were confused. HFY, said her junior assistant, a young Vorath named Pelix1, his one showing he had just finished his first training cycle. The resonance signature from sector null margin doesn't match what we expected. I see that, Pelix1. It is registering biological complexity at Class 7. I see that too. But Class 7 biological complexity requires a minimum of 40,000 years of uninterrupted atmospheric stability. Sector null margin was flagged as geologically violent only 80,000 years ago. HFY said nothing for a long moment. She pulled the data thread with 2 of her 6 fingers and stretched it across the display wall. The numbers didn't change. Numbers rarely had the decency to change when you wanted them to. Run the calibration check, she said. I ran it 3 times before I called you. She looked at the young assistant. He had the thin, pale markings of the northern breeding pools and was literal and deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. He was not the kind of junior officer who panicked, which meant this was real. Plot a course, HFY said quietly, and do not log it on the collective channel yet. Pelix1 blinked 2 of his 4 eyes, the equivalent of a raised eyebrow. That is against protocol. I know. Do it anyway. He did it anyway. Because HFY had been mapping for 200 years and had never once asked him to break protocol before. Whatever was at sector null margin, she wanted to see it first. The Patient's Accumulation dropped out of fold transit 40,000 kilometers above the 3rd planet of a quiet yellow star. The ship's outer shell adjusted to passive mode. No emissions, no active scanning pulses, nothing that would disturb the local electromagnetic environment. HFY sat down. She did not sit down often. The Vorath stood during working hours as a matter of cultural discipline. Sitting was for rest cycles. But her legs had made a decision her mind hadn't fully processed yet, and they had decided this required sitting. The planet was loud. Not in sound. In signal. Every frequency band the ship could pick up was filled with organized electromagnetic signals. Not from nature or living things, but from intentional, complex communication. Hundreds of thousands of signals were hundreds of thousands of simultaneous signal streams bouncing off an artificial reflective shell the planet had somehow constructed in its own upper atmosphere. They're talking, Pelix1 said. They are talking to each other, HFY corrected. Constantly. All of them. At once. The Vorath communicated through directed resonance. One sender, one receiver, precise and efficient. The idea of an entire species broadcasting simultaneously to everyone and no one felt, to HFY's sensibility, like a room where everyone was screaming. And yet, she pulled the signal analysis deeper. The streams weren't chaos. They were images. She searched for the right Vorath word and couldn't find one. Layered. Music, speech, data, images, arguments, confessions, and humor all occurred at the same frequencies, and the creatures down there were somehow filtering them. Choosing what to receive. Navigating the noise like it was a landscape they'd been born into. Because they had been. Biological count, she said. Pelix1 checked. Checked again. 8,400,000,000, approximately. All on one planet. Yes. The Vorath census of all known sapient life across 12,000 catalogued worlds included, at last count, 41 billion individual beings. This single, small, geologically young planet held nearly a quarter of that number on its own. What is their developmental classification? HFY asked. Pelix1 hesitated. The developmental classification system had 7 tiers, ranging from pre-tool to post-scarcity. It was a clean, elegant system that the Vorath Collective was very proud of. I can't classify them, he said. Why not? Because they're in all 7 tiers simultaneously. Some populations on the planet have eliminated material scarcity. Others are still using combustion tools. Some are mapping their own genetic code with precision instruments. Others, in adjacent geography, are dying of preventable infections. He paused. They exist in every developmental stage simultaneously. The classification system assumes linear progression. HFY was quiet for a very long time. Outside the viewport, the planet turned, blue and green and white, unhurried and indifferent to being observed, spinning at exactly the pace it had always spun. "Keep the channel closed," she said. "I need to think." HFY didn't sleep that night. Vorath required 6 hours of metabolic rest per cycle, and she spent all 6 of them sitting in the dark of her cabin with the planet's data streaming across her personal display. She had been trained to approach anomalies as errors first. The collective's epistemological doctrine was clear. When reality contradicts your model, suspect the measurement before you suspect the model. It was a beneficial doctrine. It had saved the Vorath from a great many embarrassing theoretical overcorrections over the centuries. But she'd checked the measurements 14 times now. The planet wasn't an error. What troubled her most wasn't the population density, or the developmental contradiction, or even the sheer volume of signal traffic. What troubled her was the archive. Every sapient civilization the Vorath had ever catalogued stored knowledge in a single unified form: biological memory, resonance crystal, or quantum lattice, depending on the species. Knowledge was precious. You preserved it carefully in one place with controlled access. This planet had, she was still not sure she was reading this phrase correctly, externalized its collective memory into a distributed network. Every individual carried a device that provided them with access to the entire accumulated record of their species. Billions of years of physics, history, biology, art, personal confession, false information, correction of false information, argument about the correction, and argument about the argument, all of it available to every one of the 8 billion at any moment. And most of them used it to look at images of small domesticated animals. Pelix I had pointed this out with genuine distress. "They have solved the problem of universal knowledge access," he'd said, "and they use it predominantly for entertainment." HFY had surprised herself by not finding this troubling. She found it, in some language she didn't have a word for, recognizable. As if the distance between having access to everything and choosing comfort was not a failure of the species but simply a feature of minds that felt things. She filed that thought away. It felt important. At the end of her rest cycle, she made a decision. She opened the collective channel. The response took 11 minutes, fast by collective standards. Within 40 hours, 3 other survey vessels had been redirected. The sector null margin anomaly was discreetly reported to the Vorath High Cartographic Authority by the age of 70. Within 6 days, 17 vessels were in passive orbit. The planet kept spinning. The signals kept flowing. The small domesticated animals kept appearing in the image feeds. None of the 8 billion knew they had an audience. Word moved through the galaxy the way all important things move, officially through proper channels and much faster through every other way. The Vorath filed their preliminary report with the Galactic Census Authority, which was a body of 31 species who had agreed, over several centuries of negotiation, on a shared framework for cataloging new sapient life. The framework had 47 steps. The Vorath had completed step 1. But the Census Authority's administrative network was not secure. It had never needed to be. In 6,000 years of cataloging, new sapient species had been discovered at an average rate of 1 per century, and they had always been small, isolated populations on marginal worlds, early stage, pre-signal, and simple to classify and file. So when the preliminary report leaked, and it leaked within hours, the response was unlike anything the Census Authority had been designed to handle. The Duvari came first. They were swift travelers, a species of winged cephalopods who had mastered full transit 4,000 years ago and had spent most of that time being everywhere at once. They arrived in sector null margin with 11 vessels and immediately began passive observation, saying nothing to the Vorath, who said nothing back. The result was normal Duvari-Vorath relations. Then came the Solon Compact, 3 species who shared a governing body and traveled together in vast, slow arc ships. They took up a position at the outer edge of the system and began running their analysis. Then the Mirati. Then the Gren Sodality. Then the scattered individual observers, representing species that are too small or too reclusive to have formal survey fleets, included single ships, private vessels, and academic institutions that pooled resources to send one representative. Within 3 weeks of HFY's first course correction, 47 vessels from 19 separate civilizations were orbiting or hovering near the quiet yellow star, all watching in silence. None of them had announced themselves to the others. None of them had coordinated. They had simply all come independently, drawn by the same thing. The preliminary report contained one line that no one in the galaxy understood. The subject species appears to experience a stable cognitive state characterized by simultaneous internal contradiction. The Vorath had meant it as a technical observation. A curiosity needs to be resolved. But every species that read it had felt something shift in them, a feeling none of them had words for because it had never come up before. It felt, distantly, like recognition. Census Authority Protocol was extremely clear on the subject of pre-contact sapient species. You did not make contact. You did not alter the electromagnetic environment of their system. You did not, under any circumstances, attempt communication until the 47-step process had been completed, reviewed, approved, and ceremonially ratified in a session of the full authority, a process that took, at minimum, 40 years. HFY had followed protocol her entire career. She had also been watching this planet for 3 weeks, and something was happening down there that the protocol had not anticipated. Not a crisis. Not a catastrophe. Something quieter and harder to name. She had been parsing the signal streams more carefully now, aided by the patient accumulation's language modeling systems, which had, faster than she'd expected, faster than she was comfortable with, begun to decode the planet's primary communication languages. There were many. Thousands. But the broadcast networks used a smaller subset, and those were now partially readable. What she was reading was, she didn't have a word for it. The species was an argument with itself. It was not the clean, productive disagreement that Voritha's academic culture practiced, which involved structured debate with rules and resolutions. The result was something messier. Billions of individuals simultaneously holding positions, defending them, abandoning them, adopting new ones, grieving the old ones, attacking each other, forgiving each other, falling in love with each other's ideas, and then feeling betrayed when the ideas changed. And underneath all of it, a current she kept returning to like a river running under louder water. They were afraid. Not of invasion. Not all were scarce in resources, though some were. They were afraid of something harder to map. The distance between who they were and who they wanted to be was larger than the time they had to cross it. HFY understood this. She understood it more than she had expected to. She called Pelix 1 into the measurement chamber. I am going to transmit a single passive signal into the planet's upper ionosphere, she said. Calibrated to their existing electromagnetic range. It will be read on their instruments as background noise. It will not be background noise. Pelix 1 stared at her. That is step 31 of the contact protocol. We are on step 1. I know. You will lose your cartographic certification. I know that too. What will the signal say? HFY had spent 2 days on this. She was a mapmaker. She understood that the first mark you put on a blank surface determined the shape of everything that came after. It won't say anything, she said. It will ask a question. In mathematics. A question they already know the answer to. Pelix 1 was quiet for a moment. Why a question they know? Because I don't want to teach them something. I want them to know they've been heard. The signal arrived on a Tuesday. This detail would later become historically significant in a way that nobody intended, Tuesday being, on this particular planet, a day widely considered unremarkable, not the optimistic start of the week, not the celebrated end, just Tuesday, anonymous and slightly damp. It was received simultaneously by 11 separate radio telescope arrays on 3 continents, each one tracking different areas of deep sky. The signal lasted 4 seconds. It was a mathematical sequence, specifically, a recursive geometric pattern built from prime numbers, arranged in a way that could not occur naturally but that any mathematician on the planet could verify within minutes. It was not a message. It contained no information about its origin. It asked, in the language of pure structure, one implicit question. Can you see this? The 11 facilities did not immediately share their data with each other. They spent hours running calibration checks, which is what you do when you receive something that cannot be happening. Then they shared. By the end of that Tuesday, 43 research institutions on 7 continents had confirmed the signal. By Wednesday morning it had been leaked to the press. By Wednesday afternoon it was everywhere, on every screen, in every conversation, bouncing through the same vast electromagnetic web that the Vorith had been watching from orbit. HFY watched the reaction cascade through the signal streams. She had expected excitement. She had expected fear. Both were present. But the thing that moved her, the thing she had not predicted but found herself unable to stop watching, was something else. Relief. Not everywhere. Not universally. But threaded through the noise like a second melody, millions of individual signals expressing, in the species' various languages, some version of the same thing. We always hoped we weren't alone. We just didn't know if we were allowed to hope. She had mapped 600 worlds. She had measured the atmospheric compositions of dead planets, catalogued the ruins of 3 extinct civilizations, and filed reports on barren moons and lifeless seas. She was not a sentimental being. She sat in the measurement chamber and felt something she had no Vorath word for. Pelix One stood quietly beside her. After a long time he said, "They're going to respond." "I know. What do we do when they do?" She thought about this carefully. "We listen," she said. "We have always been listeners. That part doesn't change." The response from the planet came in 17 hours. It was impressive. They used the same basic structure, built on it, added another layer, folded it back and finished it with something new. A pattern that, after some time, the patient accumulations translation system confirmed, showed a ratio seen in the spiral shapes of living things throughout the planet's ecosystem. They hadn't just answered. They had introduced themselves. "We are made of this," the sequence said in the language of mathematics. "This spiral. This ratio. This shape keeps appearing in the things that grow." HFY broadcast the response to the other 46 ships. For 6 hours the channel was silent. Then it exploded. The Duvari representative, a senior navigator named Voss with a broken wing, the Duvari named themselves after notable injuries, considering survival more honorable than pristine health, opened a direct channel to the patient accumulation and said, without preamble, "You broke protocol." "Yes," HFY said. "The census authority will revoke your certification." "I expect so. I am filing a formal complaint." "That is your right." Pause. Then in a different tone he said, "The spiral sequence. The biological ratio. Was that it? Did they choose that specifically?" "I believe so." Another pause. Longer. "That ratio appears in the Duvari wing vein structure." "I know," HFY said. "It appears in the cellular architecture of every sapient species I have ever mapped. I believe they chose it because it is the one mathematical truth that everything alive shares." The channel was quiet. Then Voss with the broken wing said very softly, "They didn't say hello. They said we are family." "Yes." Without knowing if that was true. Without knowing if we existed. "Yes." The formal complaint was never filed. The eldest delegate aboard the Solon Compact's Ark ship was a being called Marit of the Long Sleep, who was, by Solon reckoning, approximately 900 years old. She had been in voluntary hibernation for 400 of those years, a common practice among the oldest Solon, who found continuous consciousness exhausting and preferred to experience time in long, curated stretches. She had been woken for this. Marit of the Long Sleep reviewed the signal exchange, the planet's data profile, and HFY's preliminary report with the methodical patience of someone who had seen many things and learned to let urgency pass through her without catching. Then she requested a private channel with HFY. "I want to tell you something," the old Solon said. Her voice had a particular texture of mind that had been stored for a very long time. "About what happened to my species." "I'm listening," HFY said. "The Solon were discovered 900 years ago. I was alive then, young, just beginning my first long sleep. When we received confirmation that other intelligences existed, our society, I cannot fully explain what happened to our society." She paused. "We had been alone for so long that aloneness had become part of our identity. Our philosophy, our religion, and our understanding of what it meant to be alive were built on the assumption that consciousness was rare and precious and solitary. When we learned it was not, many of us did not survive the revision." HFY said nothing. "I am not saying the planet below will suffer the same rupture," Marit continued. "They are different from us. They have been broadcasting in silence for a long time already. They have been sending signals outward for decades. They expected a response. They built infrastructure for hoping." Pause. "We never did. We never dared." "You think they're ready?" HFY said. "I think," Marit said carefully, "that they have been ready for longer than we have been willing to come. I think we were afraid of them." HFY considered this. "Why afraid?" "Because they hold contradictions without resolving them. They love and destroy in the same generation. They map the stars and cannot agree on how to feed themselves. They are the only species in our entire census that has ever produced art depicting their own extinction and called it beautiful." A long pause. "Every other species in the galaxy chose one way to be. These people chose everything. Simultaneously. And somehow, they are still here." "Caro," HFY said quietly, "the Vorath word for a completed data set, for the satisfaction of a thing finally whole." "Yes," Marit said. "Exactly that." Her name was Myachin. She was 26 years old and had been running night shifts at the array alone for 3 months because the funding had run out and everyone else had gone home. She had been there on Tuesday. She had been the first person at her facility to run the calibration check and the second person in the world to confirm the signal. The first was a retired engineer in Iceland who immediately called his daughter before calling anyone official, which was, Maya thought, the correct order of operations. She had not slept much since then. It wasn't anxiety keeping her awake. It was something she kept trying to describe in her research journal and couldn't quite land. The feeling of standing at a door that the whole species had been knocking on for decades and hearing, finally, knocking back. She was on shift the night the second signal came. This one was different. It was longer. Not a question but something that took the array systems 4 hours to fully decode. When the translation came through, Maya read it 3 times. It was a map. Not in their solar system. Not of nearby space. A map of something else, a structure too large for her to immediately comprehend, until she realized she was looking at it wrong and rescaled. It was a map of the signal traffic from their planet. From outside. Showing what the planet looked like from 40,000 kilometers up, all those simultaneous transmissions, all that noise and music and argument and love and comedy, rendered as a visual pattern. From outside it looked like a living thing. Like light moving inside something breathing. Underneath the map, in the same prime recursive mathematical grammar, was one new element. The translation system struggled with it for an hour before offering its best attempt. This is what you look like from here. We thought you should know. Maya put her head down on the console. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure what she did. It wasn't quite any emotion she had a name for, something between gratitude and grief and wonder, all arriving at once, the way large things sometimes do when the door finally opens. She picked up her pen and wrote in her journal, "We spent so long wondering if anyone was watching. It didn't occur to us to ask what they saw." The Galactic Census Authority convened an emergency session. It was, by all accounts, the least orderly session in the authority's 1100-year history. The representative from the Gren Sodality showed up after saying publicly that HFY-4's mistake with the rules was not only okay but also the most important decision about maps in recent times, which made the official delegate from the Vorath Collective file 3 different complaints before the session had even really begun. HFY-4 attended via long-range transmission from Sector Null Margin, which she had not left. She had no interest in leaving. The formal revocation of her cartographic certification took 11 minutes. She accepted it without comment. What followed took 6 hours. The question before the authority was not whether to proceed with contact. The signal exchange had already made that determination, and no procedural resolution was going to reach back through time and unmake it. The question was, how do you make formal contact with a species that has already answered you? The 47-step protocol assumed the contacted species would be unaware. It assumed, built into its very architecture, a power differential, the advanced civilization descending carefully toward the less advanced one. The planet had responded in 17 hours with a mathematical statement about the shared biological structure of all living things. The power differential was unclear. Marit of the Long Sleep addressed the authority from the Solon Ark ship and said the thing that everyone had been circling without landing on: we may need to reconsider the assumption that contact is something we do to them. They may be contacting us. The chamber was quiet for a long time. HFY HFY thoughts. The Vorath phrase had no direct translation into other languages. It meant that, approximately from this point, a new kind of counting would begin. She looked at the planet through the viewport. It was still turning. It was always turning. She was no longer a senior cartographer. She had been stripped of the title at the emergency session, her 200 years of service reduced, by procedural vote, to a file marked irregular conduct. She filed one last report anyway. She addressed it not to the Vorath Collective or the Census Authority but to the General Academic Archive, a public record accessible to any species in the network. It was not a standard cartographic report. It began. I have spent 200 years mapping places. I have always understood mapping as the act of describing what exists. I have filed this final report to correct a misunderstanding I carried for my entire career. Mapping is not description. Mapping is attention. When you map something, you are not simply recording it, you are deciding it is worth the time it takes to look carefully. You are saying this matters enough to measure. The 47 steps, designed to manage contact with a species not yet aware of its surveillance, prompted me to defy protocol. But this species had been looking back for decades. Their instruments were pointed outward. Their signals were already moving through space before we arrived. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were in the act of discovering, reaching without knowing toward what. I sent a signal because I could not, in good conscience, let them reach into silence any longer. What I did not expect, what I want to record for anyone who comes after me in this work, is what happened when they responded. Not the content of the response. The speed of it? 17 hours. Not to confirm the signal. Not to convene committees. 17 hours from receipt to reply, and the reply was not cautious, it was generous. They offered kinship before they had any reason to expect it would be accepted. I have mapped 600 worlds. I have never before measured a civilization and found that its most prominent feature was Hope Star. Asterisk. I am no longer a cartographer. I am a student. And I have a tremendous deal to learn. HFY 4, formerly Senior Cartographer, Vorath Collective Survey Division. The formal first contact mission launched 8 months later. It was redesigned from scratch. The 47 steps folded into something new, something that had never been written before because it had never been needed before. Contact would be mutual. The planet would be told not just that they had been found but that they had been watched, for months, by 47 ships from 19 civilizations, all of them drawn by the same thing, all of them held in orbit by a feeling none of them had words for. The mission designers debated for weeks about how to frame this. How do you tell a species, we were here watching for months and we didn't announce ourselves? How do you explain that the silence was not indifference but something closer to awe? They eventually asked HFY 4, who was living on a small research station near the system's outer edge, spending her days parsing signal streams and feeding data to a growing network of linguists from 6 different species. She thought about it for a day. Then she said, tell them the truth. Tell them that when the signal went out through the census network, when 47 ships came to a single star system, independently, without coordinating, the galaxy went quiet. Not afraid. Not hostile. Quiet is the way you go quiet when something is so unexpected and so correct that you need a moment before you can speak. Will they understand that? The mission designer asked. HFY 4 thought about Maya Chin, whose personal signal she had spent 3 months quietly tracking through the planet's networks. She thought about the journal entry her translation system had decoded. We spent so long wondering if anyone was watching. It didn't occur to us to ask what they saw. Yes, she said. I think they'll understand that better than any of us. The first official transmission from the Galactic Census Authority to the planet arrived on a Wednesday. Maya Chin was on shift. She decoded it alone at 3 a.m., in a quiet room full of humming instruments, the way she had decoded everything else. She read it once. Then again. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote one line in her journal, underlined it and put the pen down. They weren't silent because they didn't care. They were silent because they didn't have words yet. Outside, the sky was the same sky it had always been. It just wasn't empty anymore.